Whether we've been creating elementary stone tools, travelling into space, or even developing our own artificial intelligences, since the beginning of time, humans have been fascinated by how our world works and how it fits us. Design thinking has exploded into the 21st century workplace. It's a methodology that is designed to put humans squarely at the centre of everything we do. And this series explores where it's come from and where it's going. From a methodology for businesses to a philosophy for life, design thinking is changing the world.
That's Richard Adams, and I'm Sam Fry. On the last podcast, we heard that design thinking is a method for creative problem solving, which has been taught in business schools, universities and businesses over the last 20 years. Today, we explore how well understood design thinking actually is, and what people think of the design thinking industry that has grown up over the last 20 years or so. We're going to hear from people in businesses, design education, to artists and designers. So, Act 1. Where does design thinking work best?
Here's Amanda Foreman from Zone, a cognizant business. We asked her whether it's mainly used in software design.
Well, I think, like you said, software it works well in. I think any sort of like application or software development, I think it's very helpful. I think service design as well, the idea of like how do we test various parts of like a service. I think even in business, like new business areas, so that's the area that I work in, is in business design, which I feel like is such a vague, non-helpful term. And I don't think anybody really uses it much. It's kind of new, but it's this idea of like, how do we combine like strategy and almost like management consulting practices with design concepts? And so I think it's that idea of, the marriage of different things and applying it to different spaces with the idea that, ultimately like my job might look very, very different on every project I'm on, but it's ultimately my goal is to keep this iterative, human-centered, value-driven approach to how I solve problems, while also looking at, the problems I'm solving might be, is this a valuable piece of software for this person to build from a market perspective? Not, does this UI make you click on something so that you purchase more stuff necessarily? So I think it can be applied to different areas in different ways, but it might look slightly different depending upon the context you're in.
Alongside lean and agile processes, design thinking is becoming a key way of helping to create software. But it's also being used to explore other challenges across businesses. It isn't just being used to design software. Here's Hal Wirtz from IBM.
One of the most powerful concepts that design thinking espouses and helps people practice is the ability to look at a situation and look at a challenge, look at a context, and think about it from other people's points of view.
Robert Hopman Jr. from Tangible UX explains how that works in practice.
So a lot of times when I engage with teams, we'll run something that we call a strategy workshop. So we get a bunch of people involved in product decisions into a room together, and we would cover the walls with butcher paper, and we'd have whiteboards, and there would be dry erase markers and regular markers and thousands of sticky notes. And basically, throughout the course of the day, we would begin by diagramming out basically the current state of things in some sort of problem area. What does the current problem-solving process for a person look like? How do they get this thing of value that they're after, whether it's a product delivered, whether it's a task accomplished, something like that. We'll diagram that out on this butcher paper on the wall through a facilitated conversation, and then we'll use sticky notes and various other exercises, in the context of various exercises, to identify problems in that current diagram, that current state diagram, and then generate sticky notes full of, identified problems in that current reality. And then we'll free list potential solutions to those problems. And then we'll go through some more exercises where we prioritize those sticky notes. We group them according to their themes, how related they are, So sort of chunking those things together, and then we'll organize them according to their potential impact against a business objective, or how much risk is involved with trying out that solution, or how much level of effort might be involved in building out a solution. And then, so all of these are incredibly hands-on exercises that involve, literally writing on the walls all day and filling out sticky notes and moving sticky notes around and rearranging them all day long, and ultimately coming out with basically a bunch of pictures that we all take of the mess we made in the conference room that day. But a prioritized list of potential solutions that we then want to go focus on testing out.
Clearly, it's not just about the people. To have an impact, it's also about the location and the practices used. Here's Jessica Tremblay from IBM.
I mean, when we first spun up the design and design thinking program, it was all about people, practices, and places. And the places part, that's a big part that I definitely miss. I mean, that design studio in Austin, Texas, it was home for six plus years for me. And it's where I met some of my favorite people. It's, where I've had some of my greatest challenges. It's a place where I know that I can go and I can be my full true self and bring my full true self to work. And it's a fun place to work. The place was designed. A whole floor of that campus was designed specifically for those in-person design thinking engagements, to where people can go congregate and have these big workshops and big just learning sessions with one another to really put humans and users at the center of their work.
So, design thinking works best when the combination of people, practices, and places come together. When you collaborate, are fully user-centered, and work in a conducive environment.
Well, that's nice in theory, but design thinking is now evolving, and people are being exposed to many different implementations of it. Act 2. How well understood is design thinking?
As we've been exploring design thinking, some have described it as a method with sequential steps, while others talk about it as a set of principles or a philosophy. So, which is it? And do people actually get it in practice? Amanda Foreman explains her experiences of working with clients at Cognizant.
I think in certain instances, maybe the client doesn't understand it, yes. So if you're trying to apply a certain methodology and you're trying to bring people through a journey of, okay, so we're going to diverge and we're going to gather information, and we're going to talk to people, and then once we've done that, then we're going to solutionize and we're going to narrow in on something that we're going to actually build and test. And I think that that's a big paradigm shift for a lot of people. I think that was a big paradigm shift for me, honestly. So I think I tended to think in my life quite linearly. My mom is definitely a very strong planner, make lists, check things off the list. Everything sort of happens in an order. So I think that sort of way, everything can be standardized and everything is the same and there's a clear path forward. I think that can be quite ingrained in the way that we think as people, especially depending upon what culture we grew up in or what type of school we went to. And so I think that shifting that paradigm to being more iterative, and I'm gonna test this. I'm not gonna sit and think about it until it's absolutely perfect. I'm gonna actually put something together and test it. And I think that is not a way that a lot of people think just generally in life. And so I think if you're applying that to a business context where as a society, we've solved problems in a particular way for so long. And then all of a sudden somebody's saying, oh, actually, we want you to start testing ideas right away. We don't want you to hide them. We want you to go talk to people. We want to fail fast. That. I think that's, on the client side, that's a big education. But also I even think on a practitioner side, that's a big mindset shift even for us as professionals.
Getting people to embrace principles of being human-centered, iterative and collaborative has been a massive mindset shift. It's principles and philosophies. Yet often when you talk to people about design thinking, they explain it using very concrete terms. They explain it as a workshop or a post-it workshop. Typically, they only see the outputs, not the underlying concepts. We asked Hal Wirtz whether she gets frustrated with that definition.
The reason why people use the shorthand for design thinking of a workshop or just getting out Post-it notes or, whatever their trope is because they're grappling for a set of tools to solve a problem that they have. They're like, I have this problem. I need to solve it. And they're trying to do it as fast as possible. And so they're like, and maybe design thinking will help. And so they're grappling for it. So in part, I think we can look at that as like a major signifier of a need. Like people need something to solve this problem. And so, yes, we live in a world where people try and do things really fast and they want it yesterday. And so they try and do it in the fastest way that they can, which is, hey, I can devote 4 hours to this. I can do a workshop. That's all I can do. And so those are kind of to me, those are, if I'm running a business, those are like those are the hints that, hey, there's a need here. People are exploring. And so the key here is that, there's some early education around that, like, this isn't just a workshop, right? This is going to be a long process, that this is really something that you integrate into your everyday work. And I don't know, for me, that's okay. That's part of changing minds and hearts is people will experience it once and they'll have some ahas about it. And then bit by bit, they start building it into really the best way of doing is like building into the habits of your everyday work, right? Like, that's what happens. Like, how often does someone reframe a problem in terms of a human? How often does someone say, "Oh, let's make instead of let's just make a prototype first and show it to someone," right? Versus like making doing the whole project. Like, "Oh, let's just do something in one day and bring it out and show it to people." I mean, those are kind of like the daily habits that are the real. That's the real practice of design thinking in someone's everyday life. And hopefully when someone asks for a workshop and they see the 4 hours of it, that it's just the beginning of an education around what is possible with a new set of tools and a new set of ways of thinking.
Well, that's interesting. But is that how design students actually are educated on the topic? Let's meet Joseph.
Yeah, I'm Joseph Pakal, and I'm a global innovation designer, I suppose.
Joseph Pakal is a student at the prestigious Royal College of Arts. He's studying global innovation design. He explained how they've been introduced to the topic of design thinking on their course.
It's been definitely more immersive and not necessarily presented as like a very strictly linear process. Most people that I talk to about design thinking and about design processes of any sorts think about it in a linear fashion. Even if you have sort of iterative experiences within that, or maybe perhaps your prototyping phase is very iterative in a sense that you're trying to build different models and work on ergonomics and so on. I think it's quite often omitted that actually the whole process should be a loop, or perhaps rather an upwards facing spiral, or however you'd want to call it.
Joseph mentioned there that the design process itself is a loop. And many organisations have now started to describe design thinking as a cyclical, spiralling or looping experience. In other words, something that doesn't finish. A continuous set of questions, if you like. And certainly not a one-off Post-it note workshop. Tassie Ellen Thompson, who teaches in design schools, explains the importance of questioning.
I was just listening to another, description of design thinking, and somebody was explaining how, what was design thinking, like it was in 30 seconds. And the basic gist was, coming together around a table, lots of pens, Post-it notes, big sheets of paper on the wall. And I thought, that's interesting. Have you questioned things like the size of a Post-it note will define how you write on it. The fact that the colours of the Post-it note will affect how you think about it. Your associations from the past with Post-it notes will affect what you write on the Post-it note. The pens on the paper will define whether you're comfortable with a pen and be the first to pick it up, therefore the first to impact on what gets written. the performative nature of getting up to write on a wall will define what's written and recorded. So all of these things, that's what I mean about questioning the question, is question every tool and device.
Dr. Yankee Lee also challenged the emphasis that companies put on co-creation in this process.
As I say, I think the co-creation it should be throughout the process, but I think it's changing in terms of the percentage. For example, in IDEO, they talk about the first step is design researcher is carefully investigate human experience and behavior. And so I think that part for me is designer design lead this part. So the co-creation should be more like maybe only 10% because we're going out to the field, we co-create with the people who are living in the issues. But then the later stage, when you're really engaging the community that you're working with, then the co-creation become more engaging. And I think the co-creation is not a fixed stage. It's never been 50-50. It's always changing.
Now back to Joseph.
And that kind of goes to the point of what I've been thinking about recently in the question of like the future of design practice is I generally think that like design process really needs to be much more reflective on itself and scrutinize the launched product. It shouldn't end with the launch. After the launch, we need to find out a way to measure not only what is sort of its business impact, which I think we're quite good at. Like we know, okay, the retention metrics, we know what revenue potential does this have. We measure all these things, but we also need to scrutinize the ergonomic impact and the aesthetic impact, and perhaps more importantly, the ethical impact of whatever we launch out there, right? But this is where I think like really that point of like design thinking or whichever design process you utilize for your practice, there's a point of cyclical nature to it, which maybe is not that common in the Western world or Western thought, but should probably be introduced. How do you redesign something? How do you measure what impact it had on society? And what is your responsibility then to act on that measurement?
Robert Hockman Jr. explained that one of design thinking's challenges is the lack of a common language. This, combined with a lack of metrics, has made it a struggle in practice.
I do think that one of the key difficulties for enterprises with regards to design thinking is that, again, there's no sort of common definition and there's no common, standardized set of practices that can be sustained long term. So like, you can't just teach a team or 5 teams how to do this stuff and expect it to stick because, especially if you work internally where there might be 5 different, definitions of design thinking across 5 different teams, it hasn't matured to the point within a lot of companies that it can be clearly and obviously proven, that the merits of it can be proven out, to the extent that the leadership who is funding it can tell that it's having the desired effect. Even if you're on a team that's doing a good job of design thinking, you may have a lot of artifacts, you may have things to show and go, hey, look, we're doing all this great stuff, we're making good decisions together. They may still not yet be tying those efforts to the business objectives. And so the leadership doesn't necessarily know whether that version of design thinking is the right one or whether it's effective or not. Shy of actually delivering those metrics and proving the effects of a design thinking process, it can't, it won't entirely get the support of upper tier management to keep it going. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a risk with, with design thinking, from a lack of measurement, from a lack of shared understanding, and from a lack of just being able to clearly point and go, look, we actually did something better than what we were doing before, and it's because of design thinking tools. There's no clear way to do that in a lot of places, and that's why, it runs into walls at times.
There are clearly different views on what is important about design thinking and how it's being adopted. But it is being rolled out, packaged, sold, and embraced. In many ways, it's replacing the MBA boom of the 80s and 90s as one of the must-have skill sets for businesses. It's true, like MBAs before it has become an industry of its own. So how does that affect the perception of design thinking? Act 3. What do we think about the design thinking industry?
One of the biggest criticisms of design thinking, especially when it's applied as a step-by-step method, is that it is too solution-driven. Tassie Ellen Thompson shares this concern.
In some senses, people use design thinking simply as a creative process to get from A to B. And it seems so clear that the sort of use of design thinking is structured to solve, a capitalist-based approach, product-based, a finished product, rather than to question the question, to interrogate ideas. It seems to be used as a place to get to somewhere that has marketable or capital value. Design thinking is sometimes it feels as though it's used to get from A to B as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Tassie is concerned that design thinking in its application is often linear, driven step by step, and that when this approach is taken, you will get to a solution for sure, but that actually may not be the best solution for your problem.
No methods are perfect, and like anything, it's a method. Reading John Law's brilliant book, After Method, the mess of method in social studies, this idea that whatever we use is a device, and that device shapes the answer that you will get. So design thinking is how it's used, and whatever company uses it, or individual uses it, or community group uses it, they will get the solution they come to will be affected by how they've used the process and who they are and where they are. Everything is kind of context-based.
Tassie's background includes designing physical spaces, like children's playgrounds.
When I first started designing playgrounds, I totally over-designed my first playground. Oh my goodness, I'm really sort of embarrassed about it now. Because I was so enthusiastic, and and I did workshops with the local community, and I really, involved everybody, and it was like design thinking workshops. And we had the post-its, and we had pictures, and we walked around the site, but then I over-designed it. Fast forward nearly 20 years, and my first question is, do we need a playground at all? What is play? And then start to ask other people, what do we want to do here? What kind of, do we want to play here? What kind of play? If we did play here, what kind of playing would we do? And what should we keep that is already here, that is just fine for playing with? And what should or shouldn't we add? And if we do take something away or add it, what impact does it have on other people or other things or other animals or other systems that are within our ecological biosphere, in our little, our local area or wider? What impact will it have if I design something? And that's what I kind of mean about this idea of pro-ecological design thinking, is that we really use the artistic sensibility to figure out, do we need to actually design something? Or do we need to undesign? Or do, less light design, or not design anything at all? So all of those, it's kind of a messy answer, but I think it's also quite useful. I find it useful to ask myself anyway, before I go rushing in, as I did 20 years ago with my sort of newly acquired sort of designer status, is actually go, am I really needed, or should I just, no.
The criticism is that design thinking simplifies the picture of what design is and overemphasizes certain approaches to design. Often, this is done by communicating complex ideas as a formula that can be followed. We asked Hal Wirtz what is her view of that formula.
I'm totally okay with the formula. I'm totally okay with it, because I think it is the power of what scales it. I think it's a beautiful component of it. And I mean, of course, things become memeified, right? Things that are easy to put on a Post-it note. Things that are easy to put in a simple diagram, they get memified, they get misused. I think design thinking does a fantastic job of capturing some really essential principles of what it means to make well in a simple diagram that that unfolds for you. So the first time that you do it, the first time that you hear about it, for example, on this podcast, you're like, okay, I kind of get it. I have a couple ahas. And then after a week of practicing it, after 6 months of practicing it, after years of practicing it, like that understanding deepens. Design thinking is not something that you're going to understand by watching a 1-hour presentation on it. You're not going to get it. It's about doing it. It's about practicing in your real life. And that's where the real aha moments come.
I like that idea of people deepening their understanding of design thinking through a series of aha moments. Fingers crossed you had a few ahas as you listened to this podcast. So today we learned that design thinking works best when the combination of people, practices and places come together. It's also not fully understood by those that use it, and it is often criticised for oversimplifying design. But when it is used, it can change the culture of organisations. So how does it change how people work together and empathise with their users? Are people really getting more comfortable with failing? Surely not. Maybe that's one for next time.
This episode was written, recorded and produced by Sam Fry and Richard Adams. Thanks also to Alex Stanek, Amanda Foreman, Diana Kanheiser, Al Wirtz, Jessica Tremblay, Joseph Picard, Lisa Ayama, Robert Huckman, Stiliana Minkowska, Tassie Ellen Thompson and Dr. Yankee Lee for being interviewed. All music from this podcast is available on a Creative Commons license downloaded at freemusicarchive.org. Artists include Alex Productions, Circus Marcus, Croander and Yahazar. Don't miss an episode of this series. Subscribe to the podcast feed. And also, if you could, please give us a 5-star rating to help us get in the charts. If you want to find out more about us, please go to technique.create-hub.co.uk. Next time on Techniques Explores Design Thinking.
Just ask people. Just talk to people. Don't assume that you know what they want. Just ask.
How do 160 people decide what lives should a fifth of a planet live?
And, everything I've read about design thinking is all about, giving away your ideas, sharing with others. And that's great, but you do have to develop trust.
We explore how co-creating is changing the culture of companies. And we are beginning to ask, can we trust each other?